Thank you all for coming to this talk. While I intended to share my observations as a Fulbright scholar spending more than 6 months in Taiwan, this talk is not entirely empirical. I frame my observations and reflections of Taiwan society through the lens of Artivism, the title here, the coming together of art and activism, which has been my research focus in the past couple of years, and which was why I went to Taiwan. This talk itself focuses on mass burial, cultural inaction, a public performative art event that took place 1 week after I left Taiwan. I knew the development of the event from early on when ideas about such an event were being formulated in July actually, and they were exchanged among its future organizers. And I also have met most of the future organizers. Although I could not be there physically, when it actually started in late August, I was able to follow it closely through their Facebook broadcasting and through my conversations with a key organizer. And by the way, most of the images that I use here are from their Facebook page or personal blogs or people who attended the event. And here's something unique about my research experience. As an art historian, I often started doing research after I heard about certain important artists' artworks or an art event. By then, the work has usually been done or well into the process. Rarely did I get to have the first-hand experience of witnessing the birth of an event from the very beginning. This time, I was fortunate, I consider. Okay, so let me get started with a serious introduction. Subtitle, Political Control and Censorship in Taiwan. It might sound counterintuitive to highlight governmental censorship and political control in Taiwan as a problem, since this small island has long been placed in the Western societies for its democratic political system and served as the opposite of the authoritarian mainland China. As recent as 2021, Taiwan was still touted as one of the highest performing democracies in Asia. Indeed, here in the West, Taiwan seldom appears negatively in the mainstream media, and voices of its homegrown critiques and dissents are rarely heard. While China, the country that Taiwan's current government seeks independence from, has always been portrayed in a negative light, with plenty of its critiques and dissents cited in the news. However, I would like to emphasize that democracy cannot be taken for granted, as we have seen plenty of reports in recent years discussing the decline and even collapse of the system of Western liberal democracy in different parts of the world. And here are a few keywords for this introduction. In Taiwan, progressive intellectuals and social activists find themselves fighting against the increasing governmental control and censorship in recent years under the rule of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP. This former oppositional party has now replaced the historical dominant nationalist party, or Kuomintang, KMT, to hold the power seat of the island. Taiwan citizens' journey for democracy has been complicated by the government-promoted anti-China political ideology that has divided the population and politicized the public affairs. To many critically minded citizens, democracy in Taiwan has been eroded and become a political theater performed by politicians as actors. It is now a illiberal democracy and shows signs of heading towards electoral authoritarianism. For them, this erosion process has accelerated since 2020, with the beginning of the second term of President Tsai Ing-wen, who was re-elected with the largest vote total in Taiwan's history, which seemed to have granted her administration much greater power than her previous term, starting in 2016. Surely, citizens still enjoy the right to vote. The election itself, however, has become an expensive game that only people with economic means can enter the play. The endless cycle of election campaigns, like reality live shows, have grabbed the public attention and become the focus of political activities, reportages, and debates, often turned into spectacles for mass consumption. This has the practical effect of limiting a society's political imagination. Or one could say that democracy has been reduced to election, as if election itself suffices for democracy. In reality, it is getting harder for meaningful political participation and policy input from ordinary citizens, let alone demanding accountability from the elected officials. As a matter of fact, citizens voicing critiques at governmental policies tend to be verbally attacked by the DPP government-supported Internet Navy or online army known as 1450, who have been employed to misinform the public by smearing the reputations of social, cultural, and environmental activists who raised their concerns publicly. Although the government's effort to manipulate online public opinion has begun earlier, the code 1450 came from the government's plan to allocate Taiwan dollar 14.5 million in 2019 to employ editors to correct information on the internet. The online army's misinformation campaigns have become rampant since 2020, and their basic tasks appear to be to clarify information deemed unfavorable to the DPP, usually by calling them misinformation, and to manufacture rumors against the chosen targets. Given that there is also an online army employed by the government in mainland China to manipulate public opinion, it is also convenient for officials in Taiwan to blame the other side's disinformation campaigns as the source of the domestic mistrust and discontent. The situation has become life-threatening during the challenging time of the global outbreak of COVID-19. While Taiwan appeared to be successful in preventing the spread of the pandemic throughout 2020 and bought itself precious time to prepare, it nonetheless fell short in testing and vaccinating its population. At the same time, the government took the opportunity to further its anti-China campaign among its population, continuing to call COVID-19 Wuhan pneumonia. As recent as last month, the Liberty Time newspaper reported on mass burial still used Wuhan pneumonia as the title of its report, emphasizing the origin from China, long after the virus acquired its proper scientific terminology. Taiwan's Central Epidemic Command Center, or CECC, runs a daily press release and implemented a rigid emergency time regulations to control mobility and information distribution, with punishment for people who violated these new regulations, despite the criticism about the unlawfulness of these newly introduced social control measures. Every day, CECC report on numbers of infection and the death toll became the only acceptable source of information about the pandemic to be publicly distributed. The 1450 Army has been waging intensive media attacks on individuals who express doubt or critique in public about the government's control over the interpretation of the pandemic or policies implemented to prevent its spread. When infection cases suddenly rose in Taiwan starting May 2021, the death toll quickly reached to a rate higher than the global average at the time. However, the pandemic has been so politicized by the ruling party DPP that Taiwan officially rejected the donation of vaccines from mainland China while pleading for support from the US and Japan. As such, critics point out that they are witnessing their government so clinging to the ideology of pro-US, pro-Japan, and anti-Chinese mainland that they are willing to sacrifice the well-being and life of their citizens, or as a critic puts, putting politics before epidemic management. At the same time, social stigmatization has been rampant against the people infected by COVID-19, that those unfortunate dare not to publicly acknowledge or mourn their family members died of the infection. This is especially traumatic in a society that has a deep tradition of veneration for death, and people would like to carry out elaborated funeral rituals to properly commemorate the passing of their loved ones, offering a sense of dignity to their death. Not able to do so is like unable to help the loved ones to complete the cycle of life, thus depriving dignity of their death. The failure of such an important family duty could bring grave psychological damage to those that are still alive. And it was against this kind of absurdity and tragedy that mass burial was launched by some progressive intellectuals and artists, social movement activists, and grassroots organizations. It's a 10-day performance cultural event and public art project taking place at the Freedom Square, also known as Liberty Square in Taipei, a symbolic public space near the power seat of Taiwan government. as a grassroots protest against the wrongdoings of the government. Mass burial is a contemporary enactment of the historical mass burial happened 90 years ago. During the time, more than 5,000 people from across Taiwan voluntarily came to Taipei to protest the Japanese colonial government's oppression of social movements in the island by participating in a funeral procession mourning the death of Jiang Weishui, a Taiwanese physician and social activist who played a crucial role in Taiwan's resistance movement against the Japanese rule. Back in our time, considered to be a collective citizens' action project and hoping to connect with the spirit of the historical protest, the 2021 mass burial called for public participation to openly mourn the victim of COVID-19 pandemic, including those officially acknowledged and those died of vaccination and was denied by the government of the reason of their death. Mass burial, therefore, is intended to perform a collective mourning, at the same time expose the trouble, the reality that contributed to the silent public. The event officially started on August 28th, the 100th day of Taiwan's COVID-19 outbreak, and ran through September 6th. The days were chosen because these were the ending days of July in lunar calendar, the traditional ghost month dedicated to venerating the dead, and thus appropriate for the purpose of mass burial. In a call for participation distributed in early August, the organizers write, and I'm quoting in length here because this really explains the situation and the motivation behind the launch of this public event. Since May 19, 2021, due to the spread of COVID-19, Taiwan government issued a level 3 security lockdown for pandemic prevention. The fully looting Green Camp, referred to DPP, has operated a patriotism campaign under the slogan "Tongdao Yimi, One Island, Same Fate," and launched a cognitive warfare with an online army. Taking advantage of the new international Cold War atmosphere, they have slandered all critical voice red color, meaning pro-Chinese Communist Party, and refused to make it transparent the decision-making process involving pandemic prevention and vaccination that are critical to people's survival. The mechanisms of democratic supervision and power balance from the Congress, oppositional parties, and the media have completely failed, which has a chilling effect on voters in the middle ground, and they keep quiet to avoid being involuntarily painted red color or blue color, referring to KMT. We cannot remain silent facing the birth of such a new type of soft authoritarianism, and we cannot give up our freedom because freedom of expression because of the fear of being singled out. At this moment, Taiwan needs new moral courages and the values, as well as new language and communication methods to reflect and confront the authoritarian rule exercised in the name of democratic progress. We wish to invite important art and cultural workers to abandon the mentality and language commonly used by online army, politicians, and media celebrities that have undermined social trust and hindered the social dialogues. We opt for artistic and cultural creativity to examine what life, freedom, justice, and dignity mean. We also invite the public to join this endeavor, and together let us walk out of indifference, cynicism, and helplessness so as to take on the political responsibility of our era, prove that idealism is not dead, and create a different moment. So identifying the deteriorated political and social environments that suffocate the freedom of expression in contemporary Taiwan, organizers hope to activate citizens' participation via the means of art and culture in order to challenge the soft authoritarianism that's on the rise in this island. Thinking about that most of these organizers have been fighting for liberty and democracy since the 1980s, when they were in their early 20s or late 20s, when Taiwan was still under the then authoritarian KMT's one-party rule. It must be disheartening for them to see the hard-won progress is threatened by the now ruling party that they once laid hope for and enthusiastically supported. This attempt to gather leading art and cultural professionals to collaborate with social activists is therefore an alternative endeavor to take on the political responsibility of this era, since direct political engagement has become less feasible. Art and social activism, therefore is merged into Artivism in the conception of mass burial. Itself a multidisciplinary public art project, mass burial involved various media and approaches such as choreography, poetry, architecture, performance art, theater play, exhibition, craftswork, and public forum. At a press release announcing its launch, its chief organizer Wu Yongyi, who actually officially retired in early August, but nonetheless, he said that this is the project he took up after his retirement. He's also a veteran social activist, a researcher at Taiwan International Workers Association, and a former professor from National University of Arts in Tainan. He promised that the mass burial is going to be the most remarkable art event in Taiwan this year because it was going to present the works of some of the most prominent art personalities of the island. Indeed, as a self-funded public endeavor pulled off within less than 2 months, an unusual short period of preparation considering its scale, the list of participants was extremely impressive. For example, we have Xie Yingjing, the island's most internationally known architect, and his team contributed a mass tent at once an artwork and a canopy that shield or provide a comfortable shading space for anybody who would like to take shelter from the summer heat in Taipei. And this underneath these cultural programs unfold. And I'm going to go back to this work. So I'm just mentioning this in passing. And then Chen Jieren, another Taiwan's very well-known and internationally established visual artist and film director, contributed mass standing, a work that lasts every evening from 5 to 7 until the last day. And then we have Wang Meiqin, Taiwan's most outspoken playwright and filmmaker, theater critic, and director, and who is famous for his uncompromised attitude toward the cultural authorities, joined one of the mass night talk. While established in their distinctive fields, all these three were also recipients of the National Award for Arts, Taiwan's highest official recognition given to arts professionals once in 2 years. Besides, senior choreographer Yu Junming spent 4 days writing down the case numbers of COVID-19 victims on a big scroll of paper and name it Anonymous Diary to honor the deceased. And this anonymous diary is printed on life-sized color paper and later used by participants to make origami crayons to mourn the dead and pray for the sick. Performance artist Zheng Qiming launched the 10-day performance art, Mirror Voice, and theater director and actor Dong Huiming and his team contributed Mass Tree. It ran the first 2 days for mass burial. It's an action theater. And the theater director and leader of People's Theater Movement in Taiwan, Zhong Qiao, contributed several poems as his contribution to mass burial. Likely informed by his long-term experience working with marginalized social groups in theater work, Zhong acknowledged that the force that could be stimulated from ordinary people when they are given a proper chance with a statement, the powerless can become a mass when standing together. The central theme of these art professionals' works is remembering the deceased and calling for the public to take action to make government officials accountable, in a way, to become responsible citizens. These ongoing artistic activities were accompanied by archival exhibitions for the powerless, referring to marginalized social groups such as migrant laborers from Southeast Asian regions. They are in greater number and who are doing dirty, hard job, but the group that's least acknowledged in Taiwan, and they endure structural and systematic discrimination. And then other groups that are referred to as the powerless, patients of infectious disease such as leprosy, women working in entertainment industries. These groups have long been discriminated in Taiwan society and have experienced worsened hardship during the pandemic when business was shut down and restrictions for mobility were implemented by the authorities. The exhibition displayed photos, props, They were used in protests and strikes from the past. And in the afternoon, an altar was set up to honor the deceased, and then a priest was actually invited to provide a proper farewell to the deceased, including people died of vaccination, people died of COVID-19, and also people who died because of forced dislocation and other like pollution and other man-made disasters. And at the morning ceremony, the photos of leading political figures in charge of Taiwan, president, the vice president, and other officials who were believed to have contributed to these deaths were placed in front, as if they were coming to apologize for what they have done. Every evening, a musician or a singer would perform to honor the deceased right before the nightly forum, mass night talk began. The forum takes its historic reference to the famous Decameron by the 14th century Italian author Giovanni Boccaccio in response to deadly pandemic Black Death, given that human beings are again living under the threat of a massive pandemic, this time COVID-19. The talk series simultaneously broadcasted via Facebook and YouTube is themed on listening to death, and every night it focused on one topic. In total, the forum did 3 hours or so talk every night, featuring leading researchers, practitioners, and activists in the domains of arts, social movements, environmental protection, labor rights, animal rights, etc., and concluded with conversations among speakers and the audience. Starting with the first night, dialogue with the dead. Here, speakers shared stories of relatives died of COVID-19 or government-sanctioned vaccination, AZ. One speaker talks about social death, referring to online armies attack on individuals by creating fake news about them and killing them socially. If you are under attack, there will be so many negative news about you that it's hard for other people who do not know you to personally not being affected, because nowadays people first find out about other people through social media. So the consequence is actually quite devastating. So the speaker shares that during the old time under martial law, people who were very clear about what kind of consequences they are going to get if they decided to protest. They decided to step over the red line. But they were sharing that nowadays, the online armies attack is like everywhere and it's so unpredictable. You actually even don't know. So you will not be prepared. You thought you were saying something out of common sense, but all of a sudden you'll be attacked beyond your own belief. And this was followed by from additive-fed U.S. pork to Meiqin vaccine, how did democracy die? Activists shared their stories of fighting against the import of additive-fed U.S. pork, which they failed because the government backed up the import, and against the domestically produced Meiqin vaccine, which they kind of failed again because Meiqin began to be implemented. This vaccine is considered controversial because it was granted emergency use authorization in July before starting phase 3 trials. So the vaccine only completed 2/3 trial of under 4,000 participants in Taiwan that did not generate any data on its efficacy. And this was followed by another very interesting topic, algal reefs. How did the ecological ideals disappear? This is related with environmental organizations' effort to protest the more than 7,000 years old algal reefs in Datang village along Taiwan's northern coastline, which is at risk from a government-sanctioned $2.2 billion liquefied natural gas import project. Largely unknown to the public, the Datang algal reefs is home to a significant population of maritime life, including threatened and endangered species. And scientists have declared its rich ecosystem to be one of the kind in the world. Unfortunately, much of this unique ecosystem has suffered constant destruction from industrialization and pollution in the past, and what has survived is now under a major threat from the proposed natural gas development project. The current President Tsai Ing-wen, back in 2013 on a election campaign, low down forever algorithms. And then in 2018, she again promised that destroying algorithms is not an option. But to the disappointment of environmentalists, she has since turned away from her promise. While officials denied that the project would endanger the algorithms, protesters or environmentalists nonetheless continue their protest by displaying evidence otherwise to raise public awareness. And in early 2021, they began a campaign urging the public to push for a referendum to protect the area, the first ever referendum about ecological protection in Taiwan, if passed. And because of the outbreak of pandemic, this referendum has been postponed. They are going to do this in December if they get enough people to sign. Back in May, above-mentioned artists Wang, Zheng Qiming, and other their artist friends launched a performance art project entitled Da Tang Algorithm Live Show, the label of man and nature, to support this referendum and to protest against the short-sighted economic behavior. Using their very bodies as the mediums, artists lay down, ran, crawled, or performed rituals to interact with natural elements such as sunshine, wind, earth, water, and sand. Their strenuous physical actions on the one hand display the fragility and insignificance of human bodies in front of the vastness of nature, and on the other hand also convey the fighting spirit of individuals in the effort to protect nature. Coming back to the night talk, it was followed by From Mass Burial to Mass Tent, the Death and the Rebirth of History and Culture. Speakers shared how an archival team excavated from history images produced during the mass burial 90 years ago and produced a documentary to revive the almost forgotten history of Jiang Weishui and his colleagues' resistance against the Japanese colonial government in Taiwan. And then we have the fifth night, How Did the Cat Die? How Did the People Die? This topic came from the news that Tsai Ing-wen, the president, tweeted offering condolence to US President Biden after he tweeted about the passing of his family dog in June. Critics expressed their anger, saying that every day there were people in Taiwan died of the pandemic, but their family members did not get any condolence from the president. But the cat, instead the dog, was used here because Tsai, the president, keeps a cat as her pet. Then we have stigma that cannot be relieved, discuss structural and social discrimination against the people working in the entertainment industries and their hardships. Then the Night for the Youth and the Song of Labors concern struggles and aspirations of young people in increasingly competitive, divided society. And then Eighth Night, The Death of Spatial Imagination, features leading architects and architectural scholars who discussed the discrepancy between rapid advance in the building world with sustainable technology and cheaper materials and the skyrocketing housing prices in cities, and pointed out the lack of political and economic incentives for the government to promote affordable housing in Taiwan. The forum ended with a roundtable discussion. Are cultural actions useful? Dialogues among artists, social activists, and the marginalized. Speakers and audience took this opportunity to discuss some of the most pressing issues in Taiwan that are often avoided by the mainstream media during this emergency period, such as the increasing authoritarian approach of the ruling party, political and bureaucratic corruption, ecological deterioration, stigmatization, and discrimination against certain social groups, etc. So, considering the wider range of critical topics mass night talks covered, the number of leading experts in relevant fields invited, and the heated discussions among speakers and between speakers and audience, it was an impressive success. This is even so when we consider the short time period of preparation. Zhong Xiumei, a key organizer and herself literature professor from National Chengkong University, shared that except for the first 3 night speakers that were approached and confirmed a couple of weeks in advance, the speakers for the other 6 nights were oftentimes solicited several days before. This On the one hand, it reveals the spontaneous nature of mass burial as a grassroots cultural action. They didn't know how far they could go, but they tried. On the other hand, it reveals the willingness of the intellectual communities to speak out when given an opportunity. Overall, it is extraordinary that in such a short period of time, Zhong and her friends were able to pull off such a significant public event against all odds in a time of mobility restriction and information control. Now I'm going to get to analysis of individual artworks. Given the organizers' intention to foreground art in carrying out mass burial, it is worthwhile to analyze some artworks in detail and contemplate how the artists took up the mission in championing a cultural action in the attempt to reclaim liberty and democracy in a time of heightened censorship and control. In doing so, we can see how art and activism interact as artivism in creating space for mass participation, bringing forward social criticism and fostering dialogues among people of different backgrounds. As a form of grassroots resistance and alternative cultural production, Artivism actually is not entirely new in Taiwan. As a matter of fact, it can be traced back to the 1980s when Taiwan was still under martial law or white terror that was implemented by a KMT-led government, during which progressive artists worked with their fellow citizens in pursuing political freedom and contributed to the end of martial law in 1987. They also contributed to the end of Kuomintang's one-party rule in Taiwan in the 1990s, during which DPP grew into a major oppositional party that eventually won the presidency of Taiwan in 2000. Since the post-democratization era of the 1990s, Taiwan artists have also been active in various civil discourses such as environmental protection, community building, labor organization, human rights, and disaster relief, and their work accentuates the power of art for social engagement. In a recent talk given by Christina Wang, an American performance artist to the organization Artists for Democracy in US, she emphasized that artists make cultural and cultural shift public understanding, and that's what leads to changes in policy making. I kind of think that similar kind of perception about art has motivated the continuous efforts of Taiwan artists in their pursuit of a more just, fair, and sustainable society through innovative art making. And this is particularly evident in the works of artists who participated in mass burial. Let's start with Mass Tent, and this is a very beautiful photo taken by a person who writes about environmentally related issues in Taiwan. And I get this image from his blog. This is a large, Mass Tent is a large installation work conceived by architect Xie Yingjing as a massive tree whose canopy almost covered the entire open space right in front of the Freedom Square arch to shield everybody wanting to take a temporary shelter in the heat of the daytime or coming and participate in mass burial. It was under this temporary monumental public structure that the organizers carried out other programs. Xie has been known for his work in post-disaster reconstructions in Taiwan and neighboring regions over the past 2 decades. His concept of people's architecture, sometimes referred to as social architecture, promotes collaboration between lay people and professionals with the goal that the lay people will soon be able to build their own houses in the process. He advocates employing adaptable and affordable technology such as reinforced steel system with nuts and bolts that can be easily assembled to fit different needs in different spatial and climate conditions. Mass Tent speaks to his people-oriented pragmatic approach using cheaply available canopy cloth and lightweight steel framework to create a massive tent on the square. Suitable for the morning occasion, the canopy was in black. The technique was simple and straightforward enough that everybody could give a hand, and it was indeed built collectively in early hours of August 28th to launch mass burial. This goes well with its goal, which was to foster collective actions among Taiwan citizens. What can be better than building a shading area together to be used in the following days? Symbolically, Mass Tent played with the idea of creating a temporary free space for discussing political problems, participating in a collective citizens' action, mourning the loss of lives, and reflecting on social problems, all getting harder to do under Taiwan's current political and cultural environment. Pragmatically, The enormity of its physical presence was in response to the social distance regulation for public gatherings so that the organizers could have enough space to accommodate participants and the audience. Meanwhile, the sheer size of it is also a powerful statement for the temporary attainment of such a space from the grassroots effort, especially against the backdrop of Freedom Square Arch, a permanent public monument of historical significance in Taiwan society's pursuit of freedom and democracy. Freedom Square only acquired its current name in 2007 to replace its former name, Jiang Jie's Memorial Square, a change of name considered an important milestone in Taiwan's journey towards democracy. It was therefore the more troublesome when the organizers discovered that in order to keep mass tent on display day and night, they had to pay an enormous rental fee per day to the National Performing Arts Center, the official institution that administers the use of Freedom Square. Falling short on their fund, organizers were forced to dismantle mass tent the second night after its installation. Outrageous at the circumstance, they held a press release to express their frustration and protest publicly. Freedom Square, the holy site of Taiwan's democratic movement and symbol of freedom, is no longer free. The historical significance of this space is dead. The rental fee for using the Freedom Square to organize public events used to be much cheaper, but in the past few years, it apparently has risen dramatically. They therefore condemned that it has become such a highly commercialized and for-profit rental space that access to this supposedly free public venue is practically unattainable for independent and nonprofit art and cultural organizations. And the irony and absurdity they pointed out is that annually, the government grants tens of millions of public funds to arts events sponsored by the National Performing Arts Center, while self-funded alternative arts like mass burial, without spending a penny of public funds, has to pay to the center for carrying out this program in this public space. This might well be seen as a form of ideological control to weed out social discontent, albeit not directly via political force, but via the force of money. Against the obstacle, the organizers did not give in. Instead, they worked with Xie Yinjun to bring back mass tent, considering its continuous presence at the Freedom Square a public fight to safeguard a space of democracy, and to claim the right of the powerless to have a space for freedom of expression. They argue, if Freedom Square is reduced to become a symbol without money, there is no freedom of expression, then democracy is truly dead in Taiwan. The following day, a much smaller, I think only maybe 1/6 or 1/8 of the original mass tent was indeed installed. Although no longer magnificent in the scale and atmosphere, it still provided a physical structure under whose covered area the programs of mass burial continued. Its quick coming into being reflected Xie's long-held belief that spatial constructions should be flexible in order to adapt to specific social, political, and economic conditions, and it manifested that. Moreover, because of the organizers' publicized critique and protest, the National Performing Arts Center exempted the rental fee for the much smaller version of mass tent, so it became free again, a small success. Another work dedicated to mass burial and relied entirely on the audience participation was Mass Standing, a collective participatory performance work that started on August 29th, the second day of mass burial, and continued from 5 to 7 p.m. every evening until September 5th, with the final collective standing in the midnight to conclude that day's program. And the one we are looking at is the one that taken at midnight, I think around 11. It was conceived by Chen Jieren, a visual artist and filmmaker whose Artivism can be traced back to the 1980s when he used guerrilla-style performance art and underground exhibitions to challenge the authorities. In the past 2 decades or so, the artist has focused on exploring the impact of globalization, neoliberalism, and labor immigration on Taiwan society, and in particular, addressing the hardships associated with disenfranchised social groups. To call for participation for mass standing, Chen writes, "We welcome all those who feel powerless, those who pass by, those who are confused, and those who are exhausted to the mass standing area in mass tent. While maintaining social distance, you can stand silently, sit down, or meditate according to your physical condition. You can come and go freely at your will. To complete the work, he and his team took photos of people standing every night. The purpose, besides fostering a sense of community to protest with a single gesture of standing, he puts, we want to record the current circumstance so we have historical materials to go back in the future. It is the conscious sense and effort of making history that he's referring to. Although participants were all wearing masks as everyone else in those days, mass standing has produced some powerful portraitures and hand gestures that surely will serve as important documents for this daring cultural action launched under the restricted conditions of control over individual mobility, public gathering, and information sharing. For example, the image of people holding a fist high with a solemn and firm facial expression conveys strong message. On the Facebook page that broadcasted mass burial, the poem accompanying the images reads, "This is the gesture oath vowed to dedicate to the cause of human liberation. This is a gesture of unity rallied among sincere hearts of oppressed people worldwide. This is a gesture of combat, opposing resolutely every kind of injustice in every part of this planet. This is a gesture of salute, honoring people everywhere who are committed to building a better world." With such noble goals as expressed in the poem, the simple act of standing together acquires political, social, and cultural significance. In particular, Chen relates this work with Taiwan people's historical struggle against the Japanese colonial rule and emphasizes the power of the powerless manifested 90 years ago in the mass burial honoring Jiang Weishui. He then asks, 90 years later, how should we think about the pandemic, violence, and death, especially when neoliberalism has destroyed the healthcare system, social system, and economic systems of most countries and regions around the world? He therefore calls for all who have suffered from the current powerless situation to come together, carrying on the spirit of the mass protest 90 years ago, and thinking about how people can change the current situation. In this light, everyone who participated in mass standing can be seen as consciously contributing to Chen's activism in his effort to promote alternative cultural production in Ireland that enables mass participation and expands the critical dimension of art. The next one by Zheng Qiming, who carried out the 10-day performance series Mirror Voice as his contribution to mass burial. Often taking issues with social and environmental injustice in Taiwan society, Zheng's performance art is meant to stimulate social engagement and public actions. For this series, Zheng departed from his usual preference of environmentally friendly materials such as soil, flowers, trees, or direct elements of nature such as rivers, beach, and sunlight as his props. He chose Miller as his medium for the rich symbolisms Miller has been associated with in many Eastern cultural traditions, such as window of soul, guide of afterlife, symbol of light, casting spell on demons, etc. For him, it was an appropriate intermediary for the occasion of performing a collective mourning to the dead and offering them a belated farewell. It's used in traditional Taoist rituals as an instrument to reveal the true identity of demons and ward of evil spirits also makes it relevant for an effort to make public aware of the behind-the-door illegitimate operations of government officials that led to the deaths of innocent people. And voice in the title here points to his observation that the ordinary citizens have largely lost their voice when it comes to public and political affairs in a highly commercialized and divided society. Mirror Voice, therefore, is a performance that hopes to speak out for the victims of the pandemic who have been permanently silenced and to call on the public to question those in power who are responsible for the increasing injustice in a society. As a prelude to Mirror Voice, Zheng Qiming carried out a performance on August 23rd, the exact date 90 years ago when the historic mass burial mourning the death of Jiang Weishui took place. Dressed up like a hospitalized patient, Zheng and his friend wrote down one after another case number, age, and gender of COVID-19 victims in water or charcoal on the paved floor of Forbidden Square. They were emulating the health authorities' treatment of the deceased, in which lives were reduced to these lifeless, more nominal symbols and being broadcasted every day as a way to inform the public of the government's effort in controlling the pandemic. The soon evaporated or scattered numbers speak to the insignificance of these lost lives to the authorities, which for the artist is adding one more layer of grievance to the still living family members. In the afternoon of August 28th, the day mass burial officially started. Zheng carried out the core component of Miller Voice with the participation of audience as a collective funeral ritual for the deceased. He spread out 100 small millers under mass tent, on each of which he wrote the case number and gender of one COVID-19 victim, and placed an acacia bean, a symbol of love in Chinese tradition, and a pinch of lime powder on top of the bean, a complex embodiment of life, love, death, and disappearance, as the pinch of lime powder would dissipate easily in the windy and rainy days of summer. This miller was then held by each participant in their hand as they chanted the morning poems. One might also add, they were also chanting for the return of fairness and justice, given that besides its ritualistic use, miller has been associated with fair and just governance in pre-modern China. The famous Chinese idiom, a bright miller hand above, is a metaphor for an official who is perceptive, fair, and honest, and who enforces the law without personal favor, thus a symbol of an official's personal integrity. Since Miller reflects everything in front of it without bias, it has been a symbol of ordinary people's long-lasting quest for equality, fairness, and justice. Thus, the 100 millers at the symbolic location of Freedom Square, either quietly laid on the ground or held up by participants, made a loud voice on behalf of those who could not speak for themselves because of either death or being marginalized. Considering the political connotation of the miller, the evolution of Miller Voice in the next day, August 29th, became even more striking. Under the watchful eyes of the audience, Zheng reorganized the 100 millers into 5 connected grids. He reappeared with 3 participants, all dressed up as authorized medical professionals, and they stepped on these millers one by one, slowly but surely, to crash each into pieces. They then bowed down at the 4 corners of the central grid in the posture of mourning. Subtitled "Forbid Join," this performance was a metaphoric demonstration of the state-sanctioned violence that forbade the voices of the powerless to be heard, stigmatized the protest of concerned citizens, and stifled civic participation, all exercised in the name of public safety. In a quiet evening square, the sound of crackling as performers stepped on the millers was unsettling and frustrating, all the more so when one thought about the fact that mass tent under which the performance was carried out was going to be dismantled that night. The broken millers continued to serve as the medium for Zheng as he continued the series till the last day of mass burial. He grouped each of them and placed them into a small circle at the corner next to the scaled-down mass tent in the 3rd day. For the remaining days, they quietly sit there, witnessing the rise and fall of the sun, the coming and going of the rain, and all the people who came to the Freedom Square and participated in mass burial. Zheng attended to them, such as writing case numbers and gender signs back when they were washed away by the rain. For each passing day, he attributed a new subtitle for the series, depending on the happenings of that day at the Freedom Square or around. Like Zheng's other performance works, Miller Voice responds to the troubled reality in contemporary Taiwan and is a socially engaged participatory artwork that is part and parcel of this grassroots protest under the name of mass burial. Its on-site spontaneity is also a usual approach adopted by Zheng, since many of his performance artworks tend to be done in an improvisational way, responding to the needs of protesters against environmental or social injustice. Mass Tent, Mass Standing, and Miller Voices are 3 artworks that exemplify the kind of artivism that I have been researching in mainland China and now in Taiwan. It is an art genre that seeks to address various social problems either short-term or long-term, by the means of art with a wide range of agendas, such as political reform, policy change, civil rights, environmental awareness and protection, social inclusion, cultural and educational equality, community building, etc. Here at the Mass Burial, they function to open up free space where newly marginalized voices can be heard, justice can be pursued, social and political problems can be discussed, and critical reflections on Taiwan's journey towards liberty and democracy can be made. Moving forward to the conclusion session with the subtitle, A Surviving Civil Society. This is actually kind of my tentative observation and reflections of what happened in relation with mass burial. So how was it possible to pull off such a multi-day art event in such a short period of time with very limited resources against all the limitations of mobility and public gathering? I would like to attribute it to the tradition of the civil society that has emerged since the 1980s as part and parcel of Taiwan people's fight for democracy, justice, and environmental protection against the then one-party rule. While many once democratic and environmental fighters have over time ascended to leading official posts of the now ruling party DPP and have stood on the opposite side of the civil society, they are remaining activists who struggle, but nonetheless continue to advance various civil discourses against a changing political landscape with new forms of political oppression. Among them, environmental activism continues to be a thread that connects activists of different political ideologies and builds a common ground for collaborations and collective actions. Then, there's the legacy of intellectual activism that continues to be carried out by some scholars, especially those who identify themselves as leftists, who are concerned about the livelihood of the working class and other social groups who are at the bottom of Taiwan society. So you have the environmental activists and intellectual activists collaborating in this event. Each group drew on their networks of support and human resource that made the 2021 mass burial possible. For such an extraordinary event, the turnout of people in real space was less than exciting. However, at least according to some of its organizers, they did not hesitate to point out that more than 5,000 people from across Taiwan voluntarily went to Taipei to participate in the historic mass burial honoring Jiang Weishui 90 years ago. There was a time without the convenience of internet and social media that could broadcast news fast and far, or easy mass transportation that allowed people to travel frequently. With the convenience of all these, the physical attendance of people was in no way matching the expectation that the organizers had, especially among the younger generations. And I tried to think about the issue myself and came up with a few reasons. For one, this could be due to the fact that the people were strongly advised against gathering in public, and also the fact that the vaccination rate was still low in August. Partially, it could be exactly because of the dominance of social media in contemporary times. Social media can be a friend and a foe. As a journalist points out, social media has swallowed everything, including journalism, political campaigns, personal history, you name it. And so this is the burden of our information age, in which news, no matter how significant or striking, get buried quickly by other more sensational news. And not to mention that there's the work of online army who intentionally confuse the public with fake news and make it harder to differentiate fake from real. Lastly, and I guess more importantly, the low turnout could be a sign of the declining civil society in the past decade as a result of the shrinking civil space in Ireland. As Taiwan contends itself as a working democracy, it is even harder for its politically charged intellectuals to organize events and receive public support. These events, due to their critical stance towards the government, would be naturally considered anti-DPP, and thus people associated with the Green Camp, which are majority now, will turn away from them without bothering to figure out what they are about. In addition, one can observe a general aversion to politics in Taiwan population, especially among the younger ones. Young people, the main force of the civil society in the past, have become increasingly apolitical. On one hand, this could be the sense of complacency because democracy has already been obtained, since most young people seem to have associated themselves with the Green Camp, DPP. On the other hand, life has become increasingly difficult for young people who have less leisure time to get involved politically. And that's the topic of one of the mass night talk. Expectations for success are getting higher and higher, while the path to achieve them narrower and narrower. Tied with personal pursuit and pressure from work, less young people are able to participate in events that seek to advance politically charged civil discourses. And I think this is the kind of a global phenomenon. Nonetheless, although not as well received as the organizers hoped, the fact that they could carry out the public event to the last day as planned was remarkable itself, speaking to the fact that civil society is still alive in Taiwan, albeit under challenge and is in the surviving mode now. Mass burial provided a much needed opportunity for artists, social activists, and audience who believed in the potentials of open and free dialogues to come together. Along the way, they fostered the mutual understandings among different social organizations and between the art communities and the social activist communities, while also contributed to new forms of art and cultural production and social imaginations. In doing so, they can be said to take on the political responsibility of our era, prove that idealism is not dead, and create a different moment, as hoped by the organizers. In a time when civil society is declining, it is especially important to have such alternative forms of civil gatherings that might incubate new forms of civil society. Of course, it waits to be seen what larger and lasting social impact this event would have for Taiwan. But for now, I will stop here. Thank you.